I've had more CEOs and clients go to the White House in the last 6 months than I had in the previous 6 years.
Welcome to the Campaign Trend Podcast, where you're joining in on a conversation with the entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. I'm your host, Eric Wilson. Our guest today is Alex Conant, partner and co-founder of Firehouse Strategies, a Washington, D.C.-based public affairs agency that supports companies and organizations across the economy. They've got clients from energy and finance to manufacturing and even sports. So before shifting to public affairs, Alex worked on a number of high-profile campaigns across the country and up and down the ballot, including the 2016 Rubio presidential campaign with me. In our conversation, we discussed the changing public affairs landscape in Washington in the first few months of this second Trump administration and what that means for people trying to shape the conversation in Washington. Alex, what has been the most significant change in how the corporate world engages with Washington between the first and now second Trump administrations?
The world's changed a lot in the last 8 years, obviously. I look back at 8 years ago, my firm was brand new. We were founded in 2016. We had a couple clients ready to go for the inevitable Hillary Clinton victory. And then, being at the time, now we're bipartisan, but at the time we were a center-right firm. We were pretty well positioned to help a lot of people because there was like real scrambling after Trump won. I don't think a lot of people expected it in 2016. Some people dove right in trying to engage with him and then would get burned by their own stakeholders, which kind of ultimately led a lot of people to shy away from DC. Of course, then when the pandemic hit, they needed DC more than ever. So it was a bit of a whiplash and people really trying to make it up as they go. And frankly, the entire administration was rather chaotic the first time around, too. Now, look, I don't think anyone was surprised when Trump won this time around. I think every company, all of our clients had sort of plans ready to go for what they would do if Trump won. And you've seen a much more strategic engagement of the administration this time. There's a real open door. Like I've had more CEOs and clients go to the White House in the last 6 months than I had in the previous 6 years. There's a lot more engagement. I think people recognize that to be successful, you can't just hire a lobbyist. You have to have a public affairs component to your campaigns, to your advocacy. And so that's why firms like mine have had a really busy 6 months so far.
Yeah, I think that's been the biggest. It was from day one. It was clearly different. Like the fact that you had all those CEOs at the inauguration was a huge contrast to 2017. People who don't really remember that time, there was a lot of backlash from customers and employees if they engaged with Trump. And there was uncertainty too. I was on a campaign at the time and there was constantly headlines of, well, Trump's going to get impeached in the first 3 months or he's going to resign. It was this craziness of people just had not acclimatized to the idea that Trump would be in the White House for 4 years. And we've now seen what that's like. And I think that's adjusted the worldview for the current term.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think 8 years ago, people really wanted to hide behind their trade associations, keep DC at arm's length, even though a lot happened between the tax reform in 2017 and then all the pandemic relief in 2020. This time around, people are still using their trade associations, but you're seeing a lot more direct engagement. You're seeing just a much more sophisticated public engagement by corporate America with this White House. And I think this White House is far more receptive to it than it was 8 years ago.
Yeah. So you mentioned lobbying and public affairs being a both and kind of strategy. I think some of our listeners may be surprised that there are people who thought that they could get away with just lobbying. But how does that interplay work? How do they complement each other?
Well, I think the influence industry has changed a lot over the last 20, 30 years. When I was still in government, I think lobbyists were a lot more effective than they are now. That's not to say they're not effective now, but there was a day when a lobbyist could actually get a provision put into a big tax bill moving through Congress and nobody would really notice it and the client would be really happy. Lobbyists now are primarily educating staff, they're arranging meetings, they're gathering intel. In certain cases, they're using their expertise to help, staffers craft legislation. But what they're not doing is shaping public opinion, building third-party allies, finding grassroots supporters. any of the earned media stuff. And when you look at what politicians care about, they care a lot about the media. They care a lot about what their voters back home are thinking, saying. They care a lot about, if you're a Republican, you care a lot about conservative primary voters and conservative media. They care about their donors. There's so much stuff that actually drives the decision making that lobbyists don't do. And so, I think as any successful advocacy campaign right now, you need to have the GR support because that drives the intel. That's educating members is critical. But if you're in a fight or you have advocacy priorities, you have to have the public affairs component too, to shape all those other inputs that actually drive the decision makers of policy. So we don't lobby. I've never talked to a government official on behalf of a client, nor is anyone here. We're not lobbyists, but we work very closely with lobbyists on just about every policy campaign that we're working on because we're doing the media, we're doing, and then there's a whole paid component if you're running paid advertising to try to shape public opinion. We're doing the grassroots work. We're trying to recruit third-party allies, which I think is more important than ever. Mm-hmm. So you do have, in these very sophisticated policy fights, a very comprehensive strategic approach right now, of which lobbying and public affairs are two distinct offerings.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I hadn't really thought about that in the context of this being a mirror for some of the changes that we're seeing on the political side. I was listening to a panel recently with some former EDs of party committees back in the 1990s, and they were mentioning that the biggest change that they've seen is that McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform, which led to Citizens United and super PACs and things like that. And so you have seen that shift away from the party to kind of more outside groups. Another thing that we've talked about on this show before is that the limit on contributions from PACs has stayed at $5,000 while an individual couple could give more than that. And so it's interesting to hear kind of some of that power has shifted from the lobbyists and the tools that are in their toolbox to now public opinion. What do your voters think about? Where are your grassroots?
That's exactly right. I think a lot of voters continue to have this image of lobbyists writing big checks to politicians. And as a result, the politicians are doing what the lobbyists want. Maybe it worked like that before my time, but that's not the case now.
Checks aren't that big anymore.
Yeah, in part because the checks aren't big enough. If you're a politician who's dependent on corporate PACs and lobbyist donations for your campaigns, you're going to be severely underfunded compared to the candidate who can raise money online or has giant super PAC backers.
Speaking of the campaign side, in 2024, we saw a big shift to influencers and podcasts. I think listeners of this show know that I think that was kind of overblown in terms of its impact, but significant and more of a symptom of the overall media and platform fragmentation. How are we seeing the adjustment on the public affairs side? Because I have to imagine it's even a little bit slower than it is on the political campaign side to adopting this new model where we may have to give up a little bit of control to content creators and influencers and things like that.
Yeah, look, I think every politician wants to go on Joe Rogan's show now, and
who doesn't?
So do all my corporate clients, right? It's that's not how it works. I think a lot of what the podcasters say and the influencers are talking about continues to be downstream from the agenda the mainstream media is setting. And so I just don't think you can adjust.
Yeah, they're reacting to it.
Exactly. I don't think your strategy can just be, we just need to, talk to influencers and podcast and go on a bunch of podcasts. I think that's time well spent. But I don't think you can ignore the mainstream media because that's setting the agenda, and what the podcasters and what the influencers end up reacting to, and what a lot of their content about is what they saw in the news that the mainstream media is driving. And so I think it's very, very important to get your messaging on those mainstream platforms. When I say mainstream, I use that broadly, like legacy network media, the New York Times and the Journal, but also conservative media, center-left media. I just think anyone who's actually generating original content about world events is somebody who a reporter in the classic sense of it. It's like somebody that is going to be important because what's on, you can draw a straight line from what's in the Wall Street Journal ends up being on Fox News, which ends up being whatever conservative podcaster is talking about. And so, what's in the journal is still super important and a big focus for mine. I think the second part of that is you need to generate more content now to break through than ever before, simply because, it's so hard to reach people, so hard to reach your target audiences. And there's so many different mediums, and so you have to generate content on all sorts of mediums. And so, I think we're long gone, the days of you just get an op-ed in the journal and, your problem kind of solves itself. An op-ed in the journal is still super important, but that's not going to be silver bullet.
That's the jumping off point.
Exactly.
Yeah. So thinking back to Trump 1.0, everyone had his tweets on alert. So I got the push notification on my phone anytime Trump tweeted, because that was what our day was going to be about. He's not using that channel as much anymore. We're still seeing some Truth Social. What's the intel that decision makers need to navigate the Trump 2.0 landscape?
We're 6 months into it, and I think still trying to figure it out. I think his truth posts still move markets, and we are monitoring them in real time for several clients. If you care about tariffs and you don't pay attention to his truth posts, then you're
whacked.
Yeah, you're missing it. So people care about that. But I also think people realize that it's just it's a fluid environment, and that he is apt to change his mind, that, this is all one big negotiation. And so I think people are taking a little bit of a longer term view on some of these issues, including tariffs. And people just seem to have calmed down a little bit compared to where they were, 8 years ago or, even 8 weeks ago.
You're listening to the Campaign Trend Podcast. I'm speaking with Alex Conant from Firehouse Public Affairs Strategies about the Trump 2.0 landscape and its effect on corporate America. Alex, I want to talk about this dynamic now. With Trump and his team, you don't want to get on the wrong side, but you've got to get your side of the story or opinion out there. How are you balancing this kind of unpredictable nature of the public affairs conversation where you don't necessarily know what his position on something is? How do you advise clients on how do you position yourself?
Yeah, the number one thing I tell clients is you need friends. This is an environment where you can't be the only one fighting your fight. You need allies, you need friends. And so we spend a ton of time recruiting allies. And they can be third-party groups. They can be influencers, as you mentioned. They can be just, important voices, stakeholders, media figures. More often than not, they're not national people that you and I have heard of, but they're people in the states. They're in key districts, or they're on niche platforms, or they're on social media. And, a lot of people have 1 million followers on Twitter all of a sudden. And I think you need to have as big an army as you can when you go into a policy fight. So I tell all my clients a big part of what we need to do is be recruiting friends and recruiting allies and supporters on our positions, because that's what the administration cares about. They don't want to just hear from one company or one perspective. Like, they want to hear from lots of different people. It's a recognition that the administration itself doesn't agree on anything. We talked about tariffs a minute ago. Like, there's clearly big fights happening inside the administration about what their tariff position should be. Yeah. And so, I think it's not just finding advocates for yourselves on the outside, but also finding the advocates for your positions on the inside of the administration and trying to empower them and work with them as closely as possible. Well, recognizing that you want to be constructive in your messaging, and you want to make sure that your goals are ultimately aligned with the president's goals. Mm-hmm. Good deals, which is bringing jobs back to the U.S. and bringing investment to the U.S. And we work with U.S. companies, and for the most part, those goals align with our companies. Now, they don't like the tariffs and they don't like some of the policies, but they emphasize their shared alignment on the goals, and then find advocates to help them make the cases for why the policies that they want, that Trump may disagree with, are actually going to help advance the overall goals for his administration.
Yeah, it seems like it all comes down to that, framing your issue to get an alignment with the president and his priorities. So you get into that win-win situation where Trump gets a win, your side gets a win. So going back to Trump 1.0, or the first Trump administration, I remember there were lots of different tactics, like you would want to buy Fox News in the DC market during certain hours when it was known that the president was having executive time and watching TV. Is there a tactic that was effective back then that's not working as well now?
Well, I don't think that tactic was ever very...
It sold a lot of TV spots, yeah.
Yeah, and sold a lot of TV spots. I mean, look, I think, here's the deal. Trump 1.0, nobody knew what was effective. I think people were trying every type of tactic, including the paid, which, while expensive, is also pretty easy, right? It doesn't take a lot of work to create a TV spot and put it on Fox News. I think now it's a much more systemic approach. It's a lot more behind the scenes advocacy. It's a lot more fundraising, or, building allies and recruiting third party supporters, the kind of work we just talked about. It's just, in many ways, the advocacy campaigns I'm seeing now just feel much more traditional than they did the first time around, where really it was like, can we get a donor to go talk to the president at Mar-a-Lago, because that could result in a tweet that night that effectively would be a policy win for our client, right?
Yeah.
There's not a ton of policy by tweet in this administration where you get the sense that the tweet was generated by something he just saw on TV or something a donor had just told him. at dinner at Mar-a-Lago. I think now they give full credit to the team that he's placed around him, that he clearly has more confidence in now than he did 8 years ago. But there is much more of a system. And, and then I think the other issue that we haven't talked about at all is Congress, where when you talk about like the tax bill, sure, like the White House has their own priorities, but this bill is being written by Congress. Mm-hmm. And, the advocacy campaigns that people run on members of Congress, are largely unchanged over the last 10 years, with the exception of some of the things we're talking about, like podcasts and influencers.
Yeah, we're still buying Metro ads and lots of cable news in the DC media market.
Yeah, and I think that's a reflection that, like, in a lot of these policy fights, there's billions, if not tens of billions of dollars at stake. So if you're a company, you can rent out the DC Metro billboards for less than $1 million. It's a drop in the bucket. So if it moves the needle a little bit, that's a pretty good ROI. But I don't think anyone ever won a policy fight because signs on buses.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a little bit of like boxing out your competition too. Is there a new public affairs technology or strategy that's matured since that first Trump administration that we're seeing use this second iteration?
AI is the first thing that comes to mind. Didn't exist 8 years ago, at least not the sort of generative AI that we're seeing now. I think people are still figuring out how to use it, but I can tell you firsthand, like, it is a huge time saver and a cost saver. You look at, not so much on the earned media side, like AI is not very good at pitching a story to a reporter. Like, that's relationship driven. So I think anything in politics that is relationship driven, like media, a lot of the stuff on the GR side, a lot of like the ally recruitment and, finding grassroots supporters, sort of tactics we were talking about earlier, like that's all relationship driven. By definition, you need real people to do it. But when it comes to paid advertising, I've already seen AI be incorporated in that as just a huge time saver. Literally, we have a client right now who is looking to run some spots, and a couple of years ago, I would have had to go out and hire graphic designers, and we would have had multiple iterations, and it would have cost thousands of dollars just to produce some ads. Yeah, AI can do that better in seconds and add. If I've figured that out, I guarantee anyone else who's in the creative space is also figuring it out. As I get pitches from creative firms, I can see that AI is heavily being incorporated in that. I think it'll be interesting to see how that continues to evolve. And as the technology improves, I would expect to see very different looking paid campaigns in the near future than we are used to, simply because what's possible with AI. I mean, you're just going to see much better looking advocacy campaigns now than you used to, because
it's just easier. Yeah.
I mean, nobody used to spend $1 million producing a spot for an advocacy campaign, but now we're pretty close where AI is going to produce some Hollywood quality ads that are basically free to produce. If nothing else, if you watch a lot of Fox News, the ads should be getting better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, then that's another really interesting sort of contrast with the political world. We, unfortunately, because of different state and platform regulations, are being shut out from a lot of this generative AI creative and things like that. So I think we're going to have to keep an eye on what our colleagues on the public affairs side of the house are doing, because you're going to have so much more exposure to this than we are. It's going to be really interesting. More of that, like just really good tools that we're just not allowed to access right now, unfortunately.
Yeah. I will say, like, on the work, I feel like the work I do now is much more substantive than the work I did when I was actually in politics, where, you've really got beyond the talking points and it was a lot of personality driven stuff. Now, I'm deep in the weeds on some really sophisticated policy fights, and AI, I think, can be helpful, not so much in generating content, but just basic research, helping under, I sit through a lot of meetings, like, I don't do it now, but when people do use AI to record the meetings and give notes, like, it's really impressive stuff. And I'm excited about the AI that my firm is able to incorporate into more and more of what we do, mostly because I just think it's going to unleash a lot of productivity.
Yeah, I agree. So before we wrap up, what's the most important skill set that a professional in the public affairs space or looking to make that transition, what's the skill set that they need to be developing to be effective in our current environment?
What I tell everyone is that you got to be a good writer. If you want to be a good communicator, that starts with being a good writer. And if you're a good writer, you will always be employable. in the PR space because it's just a critical skill. And so become a good writer. If you're not a good writer, take lessons. We have a writing coach come in and work with our team here. Everyone that we hire takes a writing test. So they're good writers when they start. And we want to make them better writers because the better writer they're going to be, the better communicator they're going to be. And that's at the end of the day what we're doing. We're a communications firm first. And so, people have to have those hard communication skills. I think it's really important. The second thing I'd say is, and this gets back to why AI won't replace us, is it's a relationship driven industry, media relations. So I tell people the key word there is relations. Like you need to have good relationships with reporters, know how to build relationships, maintain them, use them, and keep them fresh. And so, people that are naturally good networkers, people who have demonstrated an ability to work well with reporters, to work well with allies, third-party groups, to work well even within an office setting. The PR industry is very collaborative. You do very little stuff by yourself. It's, you're working in team environments at any agency. And so someone who is able to navigate, build, and keep relationships is going to succeed as well.
Well, thanks to Alex Conant for a great conversation. I'll include a link to Firehouse Strategies in the show notes so you can keep up with Alex and the work that he and his team are doing. If this episode made you a little bit smarter, you know that all we ask is that you share it with a friend or colleague. You look smarter in the process, and more people find out about the show, so it's a win-win all around. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your shows and visit campaigntrend.com for even more newsletters and articles. With that, I'll say thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
The Campaign Trend podcast is produced by Advocacy Content Kitchen, a media production studio.